This episode was brought to you by Skillshare. You can use my link down below to get 2 free months of Skillshare by signing up. It's a really wonderful resource for learning new skills, like drawing, painting, or even video editing. This episode was also brought to you by Audible. You can get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/moderndayjames. There's over 180,000 titles for you to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. And I'm very happy to announce that as of today, you can register for my online mentorship through Brainstorm. The class will be starting in January, and we'll meet 2 times a week for 6 hours each time. So if that's something you think you might be interested in, head over to brainstormschool.com to register. Today's episode is a YouTube edit for an hour-long video I did on my Gumroad channel. If you'd like to see the full video, you can access it at gumroad.com/moderndayjames. So today I'm going to walk you through my process for sketching exterior environments and props. And since I can't get enough of Red Dead Redemption 2, we'll do it in a Wild West theme. So the first step that I'm going to do is just blocking out a primitive form. I'm doing it in a 1-point perspective with a pretty wide angle lens, which you can tell based on the rate of convergence of my parallel lines and of the verticals that are bending towards a third vanishing point. I'm really just trying to block in the major shapes and forms right now, nothing too crazy, nothing too specific. I create this slanted wedge that will be the awning that's hanging off the front of the building. And I'm always remaining cognizant of how much force I'm using with the pen, trying to maintain a pretty light line weight throughout. And notice that I'm drawing through most of the time. Since we're doing things in a pretty light line weight at first, we can go back later and punch them out with a heavier, thicker line. I cover a lot of the perspective techniques like extrusions and modifications, both in my Intro to Dynamic Sketching Gumroad and in some of the Perspective series videos. So if these techniques at first seem a little bit confusing, refer to those first. Getting this form block out is probably the most crucial part to the whole drawing. And all of my elements like the doors and windows I just place in first as flat shapes. We're later going to punch those out with a thicker line weight and some lighting. Adding foliage and plant life is a really good way to add some organic shapes into this to contrast that really rigid and structural building. I always try to consider the craftsmanship in the subject I'm sketching. Even having a slight understanding of how the joints are formed in the woodwork really influences the line work that you use. So now that I have most of the key elements in place, I'm going to add some lighting and texture to this. As I cover in my lighting video, you can use perspective techniques to figure out where your shadows will be projected, so long as you know the direction and angle of your light source. So once I've made those 2 considerations, I start blacking out my shadow shapes. The light will be coming from the top left, so all of my shadows will be projected over to the right. I'm just going to be using 3 values for this sketch: the white of the canvas, a mid-tone gray, which I'm using a vertical hatching to create, and a pure black. For certain elements like the grass and foliage, I'll use different line work other than a vertical hatching to indicate those textures, but in general the principle is going to be the same. None of the textures are supposed to be our main focus of the drawing, so I just use a light line weight to imply the texture. Another thing to take note of is how I'm simplifying a lot of the details into just small shapes and forms. I'm not wasting any time or energy zooming in way too close to flesh out those barrels and benches. I'm just using small shapes. If you do want to get a higher resolution on those props though, we can just do a second drawing, which I'll do later in the video. Alright, so now I'm going to use this same process just on an additional 2 environments. This first primitive form that I'm creating is in a 2-point perspective with the horizon line right about center. The left vanishing point is closer in this case because we're viewing it at about a 22-degree angle. Drawing any hard surface subject really relies heavily on your ability to rotate primitive forms, so try to master this first section before moving on to anything else. But it's essentially the same setup. I'm starting with that primitive block with the wedge shape for the awning, a set of much shorter rectangular prisms for the deck, and all throughout this process I'm using reference to get an idea about how these things are constructed. They're pretty simple structures, but there's still a lot of rich detail in the woodwork. Another really big consideration that you have to make anytime you're drawing an environment is the scale of your subject. Try to find an element like a door, window, or staircase that you can compare to the height of everything else. For me, I typically use the door frame because I know it's going to be about a foot or 2 taller than the average person. Again, I'm not going too in depth with the details on the props, I'm just blocking out the primitive forms, and I'll go more in detail with it when I add some shadow shapes. And now again, once I have everything put in place, I start adding in my lighting scheme and textures. You can use those techniques I discuss in my video on textures too, which will help you decide where and how you'll place in these elements. My goal as the artist is for the viewer to be able to see the difference between the grass, wood planks, and shingles. Alright, now that our saloon has been drawn, let's do a second building. I'm once again going to start in a 2-point perspective. In this case, the right vanishing point is going to be closer than the left, so all those lines that are going back towards the right vanishing point are converging really fast, and those that are going to the left are taking a much slower course. So once again, the same idea. I start with those primitive forms, getting the large shapes in there. I place in that angled plane for the awning. Here I'm building out a catwalk that's taking place on the side of the building. I'm drawing through really light line weight. Anywhere I'm placing in stairs, I'm just using an angled plane and I'm not going too in depth with them. Now that I've placed in that door, I have a pretty good sense of scale. I like to break up any 90-degree angles that I have by placing in props. You know, you can place in moldings, barrels, benches. Anything that can just break up that 90-degree angle. In terms of design, I try to make sure that all of my buildings are asymmetrical. So I'll stagger some of the window placements and try to move things around so that it's not completely a mirrored image on both sides. And again, once all my elements are put in place, I then decide where my light source is coming from and what angle. In this case, it's going to be coming from the top left, which is going to make all of my shadows project towards the right. All of the planes that are facing towards the right, I'll either hatch or black them out with a dark mark. Now I'm going to do some callouts of the props that I've placed in so far. Elements like these barrels are really going to rely heavily on your ability to create ellipses in perspective. So make sure that you're practicing those constantly until you understand how the minor axis and degree are going to change when you rotate them. For this wagon, I'm starting out with a rectangular prism, and then I'm expanding downwards to create a ground plane. I then expand the ground plane away from the left vanishing point to create a little distance from my wheels to the body of the wagon. And then I create the axles using a set of concentric ellipses. When drawing in the spokes of the wheels, I start with the 90-degree angles, up, down, left, and right, and then I fill in the 45-degree angles afterwards. And just as we did with the buildings, now I'm going to place in my shadows in a really dark shape. After that, I'll add in any halftone values and a hatching. If you're struggling at any point, start simple, like this next prop, which is just going to be a trough. It's a rectangular prism, but it's extruded inwards from the top. And then our final prop will be another wagon. I'm going to do it using a pretty wide angle lens, and so we're getting convergence of my vertical lines down towards a third vanishing point. I'm using the same exact process as the wagon before, only this time I'm using a little bit more curvature to my vertical lines, and I'm going to use a different angle of light. For that latch door that's open on the back of the cart, I used a quarter of an ellipse to understand how that door would open. And then last but not least, our light source is going to be coming from top right, projecting a shadow down towards the bottom left. While this plays out, I just wanted to say thank you very much for watching the video, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. That way you can be notified every time I'm doing a live stream or having a guest on a podcast. And if you'd like to see the video in real time, you can purchase it on Gumroad at gumroad.com/moderndayjames. And if you'd like to get access to all the future Gumroads that I make at a discounted price, consider signing up on Patreon for just $5 a month. And in addition to that, we have a bunch of other options, like access to the archive of live streams, group lessons, and one-on-one lessons. Alright everybody, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.